What would you do if the person you trusted most in the world had been systematically destroying your life for years, and you discovered it all through a single envelope handed to you by a restaurant waiter? This is the story of Victoria Chen, a woman who thought her biggest problem was her husband missing their anniversary dinner, until she learned that his absence was just the tip of an iceberg that would shatter everything she believed about her marriage, her family, and herself. But what Victoria discovered that night would not only expose a web of deception spanning decades, it would transform her from a trusting wife into a formidable force who would reclaim everything that was stolen from her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Victoria Chen sat alone at table 12 in Le Bernardin, Manhattan's most exclusive French restaurant, watching the flickering candle cast shadows across the empty chair where her husband should have been sitting. The reservation had been made 3 months in advance for their 15th wedding anniversary, and she had spent the afternoon preparing for what she hoped would be a romantic evening that might rekindle the spark that had been missing from their marriage for the past 2 years. The maitre d' approached her table for the 3rd time in the past hour, his expression a careful balance of professionalism and sympathy. "Mrs. Chen, would you prefer to wait a bit longer, or shall we proceed with the evening?" Victoria glanced at her phone again. No messages, no missed calls. Just the crushing silence that had become increasingly familiar in her marriage to Daniel Chen, the successful investment banker who seemed to prioritize every client meeting, every business dinner, and every networking event above their relationship. "I think I should probably go," Victoria said quietly, reaching for her purse. The humiliation of sitting alone in one of New York's premier restaurants was becoming unbearable, and the pitying glances from other diners felt like physical blows to her already fragile confidence. But as she stood to leave, a young waiter approached her table with a concerned expression. "Excuse me, Mrs. Chen, I have something for you." Victoria looked at him in surprise. The waiter was perhaps 25 years old, with the earnest demeanor of someone who took his job seriously, despite working in an industry that often treated service staff as invisible. "I am sorry, but I think there has been some mistake," Victoria replied. "My husband never arrived, so there should not be anything for me." The waiter shook his head and extended a cream-colored envelope. "This was left for you specifically, ma'am. The person who delivered it said it was extremely important that you receive it tonight." Victoria took the envelope with trembling fingers. Her name was written across the front in elegant handwriting that she did not recognize. The paper felt expensive, substantial, and somehow ominous in its weight. "Who left this?" she asked, but when she looked up, the waiter had already retreated to attend to other tables. Victoria sank back into her chair and stared at the envelope. Part of her wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part feared what it might contain. After 15 years of marriage, she had learned to recognize the moments when her carefully constructed world was about to shift, and this felt like one of those moments. She thought about Daniel's increasing absences over the past 2 years, the way he had become secretive about his phone calls, the mysterious business trips that seemed to multiply every month. She had attributed these changes to the stress of his demanding career, but lately, she had begun to wonder if there was something more. Victoria had met Daniel during their final year at Columbia Business School, where she had been pursuing her MBA with a focus on financial analysis. She had been the top student in their corporate finance program, with offers from 3 major consulting firms and a clear trajectory toward partnership-level positions. Daniel had been charming, ambitious, and supportive of her career goals, or so it had seemed. But within 2 years of their marriage, subtle pressure had begun to mount for Victoria to step back from her career ambitions. Daniel's income was substantial enough to support them both, he had argued, and wouldn't it be better for their relationship if she could be more flexible and available? The arguments had been presented as romantic gestures rather than ultimatums, and Victoria had gradually found herself making compromises that seemed reasonable at the time. She had turned down the consulting position in London that would have accelerated her career. She had declined the opportunity to join a startup that eventually became a major success. She had slowly reduced her professional ambitions to accommodate Daniel's vision of their life together. And somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of the confident, capable woman she had once been. Now, at 38 years old, Victoria worked as a financial advisor for wealthy families, a position that paid well but offered limited opportunities for advancement. She was respected by her clients and colleagues, but she had never fulfilled the potential that had once seemed so promising. She had convinced herself that the trade-offs had been worth it for the sake of their marriage, but lately, she had begun to question whether Daniel had ever truly valued her sacrifices. Victoria opened the envelope with careful precision, her financial analyst training prompting her to preserve evidence, even when she did not understand its significance. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a brief message written in the same elegant handwriting as the envelope. "Mrs. Chen, what you are about to discover will be shocking and painful, but you deserve to know the truth about your husband's activities. The USB drive contains financial records and communications that reveal systematic deceptions spanning several years. You have been betrayed by someone you trusted, but you also possess the intelligence and strength to reclaim your life. The evidence speaks for itself. A concerned friend." Victoria's hands shook as she found a small USB drive taped to the bottom of the paper. Her mind raced with possibilities, each one more disturbing than the last. Financial records suggested fraud or embezzlement. Communications implied infidelity or other forms of deception. The formal language and careful presentation of the evidence suggested that whoever had compiled this information was both methodical and serious about their accusations. She slipped the USB drive into her purse and quickly left the restaurant, her anniversary dinner forgotten in the face of this new crisis. The subway ride back to their Upper West Side apartment felt endless, each station marking another minute of uncertainty about what the evidence might reveal. Victoria and Daniel's apartment was a testament to their financial success, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park and furniture carefully selected to project sophistication and stability. But as Victoria sat at Daniel's desk in their home office, preparing to insert the USB drive into his computer, the luxury around her felt hollow and potentially fraudulent. The drive contained dozens of folders, organized with the precision of someone familiar with financial documentation. Victoria opened the first folder and found bank statements for accounts she had never seen before, all bearing Daniel's name and social security number. The balances were staggering. Millions of dollars held in offshore accounts that had never been disclosed during their marriage. But it was the second folder that made Victoria's blood run cold. It contained printouts of email communications between Daniel and a woman named Isabella Rodriguez, spanning over 3 years. The messages revealed not just an extramarital affair, but a sophisticated scheme to transfer assets from their joint accounts into Daniel's private holdings. Victoria read email after email, describing how Daniel had systematically moved money from their shared investments into accounts that only he controlled. Isabella, who appeared to be both his mistress and his business partner, had helped him establish shell companies and offshore holdings that effectively hid millions of dollars from Victoria's knowledge. But the betrayal went deeper than financial fraud. The emails revealed that Daniel had been planning to divorce Victoria for over a year, but he wanted to ensure that she received as little as possible in the settlement. Isabella had been helping him document supposed evidence of Victoria's professional incompetence and emotional instability, creating a paper trail that could be used to justify minimal alimony payments. One email from Daniel to Isabella was particularly devastating. Victoria's career has been declining for years because she lacks the intelligence and drive for high-level financial work. Her contributions to our wealth have been minimal, and any settlement should reflect that reality. Once we have properly documented her professional failures, we can proceed with the divorce knowing that she will have limited claims on assets I have built through my own efforts. Victoria stared at the screen in disbelief. The man she had loved and supported for 15 years had not only stolen millions of dollars from their joint assets, but he had been systematically undermining her professional reputation to justify his betrayal. The career compromises she had made to support their marriage had been reframed as evidence of her inadequacy. She continued reading and discovered that Daniel and Isabella had been documenting her daily activities, her professional interactions, and even her personal conversations to build a case that she was an unreliable spouse who contributed little to their household. They had enlisted the help of private investigators and had even recruited some of their mutual friends to provide statements about Victoria's supposed limitations. The USB drive also contained financial projections showing how Daniel planned to structure the divorce to minimize Victoria's settlement. He had consulted with expensive attorneys who specialized in protecting wealthy spouses from excessive alimony claims, and the strategies they recommended were both sophisticated and ruthless. But perhaps most shocking was the revelation that Daniel's lucrative investment banking position was itself partially fraudulent. The final folder on the USB drive contained evidence that Daniel had been taking credit for Victoria's analytical work during the early years of their marriage, when she had helped him with complex financial models and client presentations. Several of his most successful deals had been based on strategies that Victoria had developed, but he had presented them as his own innovations. Daniel had built his reputation and income on stolen intellectual property, and he had used the resulting financial success to justify his belief that Victoria was inferior and undeserving of equal treatment in their marriage. Victoria sat in their expensively furnished home office until dawn, reading through evidence that demolished everything she had believed about her life. The man she had trusted with her heart, her career, and her financial future had been systematically destroying her for years, while preparing to discard her with as little financial support as possible. But as the shock and grief began to transform into something else, Victoria realized that her analytical training and financial expertise had not been lost during her years of compromise. If anything, her experience as a financial advisor had prepared her to understand exactly what Daniel had done and how he had done it. She possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to fight back, but she would need to be strategic and methodical about her approach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evidence on the USB drive was comprehensive, but Victoria knew that Daniel would attempt to discredit it or claim it had been fabricated. She would need to verify the information independently and build her own case using resources that Daniel could not challenge or undermine. More importantly, Victoria realized that her anonymous benefactor had given her something more valuable than evidence of Daniel's betrayal. They had given her the opportunity to reclaim her intelligence, her capabilities, and her sense of self-worth. For years, she had allowed Daniel to define her value and limit her potential. Now she had the chance to demonstrate what she was truly capable of achieving. As she carefully removed the USB drive and began planning her next steps, Victoria felt a sense of determination that she had not experienced since her business school days. The woman who had once been destined for partnership-level positions and major professional achievements was still there, waiting to emerge from years of suppression and manipulation. Daniel had underestimated her intelligence and strength, but his mistake would become her opportunity. Victoria Chen was about to begin the fight of her life, and she intended to win decisively. The fall had been devastating, but it had also provided her with the clarity and motivation necessary to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. The anniversary dinner she had been dreading would ultimately become the night that transformed her from a victim into a victor. Victoria Chen's transformation began not with dramatic confrontations or emotional outbursts, but with the methodical precision that had once made her Columbia Business School's top-ranked student. In the weeks following her devastating anniversary discovery, she became a different version of herself, careful, calculating, and nearly invisible, as she gathered intelligence about the scope of Daniel's deception. Her first strategic decision was to maintain absolute normalcy in their daily interactions. When Daniel finally returned home at 3 in the morning after his missed anniversary dinner, Victoria greeted him with the measured disappointment of a wife accustomed to professional disappointments rather than the rage of someone who had discovered systematic betrayal. Her performance was flawless because it required suppressing emotions that could compromise her investigation. She continued reading and discovered that Daniel and Isabella had been documenting her daily activities, her professional interactions, and even her personal conversations to build a case that she was an unreliable spouse who contributed little to their household. They had enlisted the help of private investigators and had even recruited some of their mutual friends to provide statements about Victoria's supposed limitations. The USB drive also contained financial projections showing how Daniel planned to structure the divorce to minimize Victoria's settlement. He had consulted with expensive attorneys who specialized in protecting wealthy spouses from excessive alimony claims, and the strategies they recommended were both sophisticated and ruthless. But perhaps most shocking was the revelation that Daniel's lucrative investment banking position was itself partially fraudulent. The final folder on the USB drive contained evidence that Daniel had been taking credit for Victoria's analytical work during the early years of their marriage, when she had helped him with complex financial models and client presentations. Several of his most successful deals had been based on strategies that Victoria had developed, but he had presented them as his own innovations. Daniel had built his reputation and income on stolen intellectual property, and he had used the resulting financial success to justify his belief that Victoria was inferior and undeserving of equal treatment in their marriage. Victoria sat in their expensively furnished home office until dawn, reading through evidence that demolished everything she had believed about her life. The man she had trusted with her heart, her career, and her financial future had been systematically destroying her for years, while preparing to discard her with as little financial support as possible. But as the shock and grief began to transform into something else, Victoria realized that her analytical training and financial expertise had not been lost during her years of compromise. If anything, her experience as a financial advisor had prepared her to understand exactly what Daniel had done and how he had done it. She possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to fight back, but she would need to be strategic and methodical about her approach. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The evidence on the USB drive was comprehensive, but Victoria knew that Daniel would attempt to discredit it or claim it had been fabricated. She would need to verify the information independently and build her own case using resources that Daniel could not challenge or undermine. More importantly, Victoria realized that her anonymous benefactor had given her something more valuable than evidence of Daniel's betrayal. They had given her the opportunity to reclaim her intelligence, her capabilities, and her sense of self-worth. For years, she had allowed Daniel to define her value and limit her potential. Now she had the chance to demonstrate what she was truly capable of achieving. As she carefully removed the USB drive and began planning her next steps, Victoria felt a sense of determination that she had not experienced since her business school days. The woman who had once been destined for partnership-level positions and major professional achievements was still there, waiting to emerge from years of suppression and manipulation. Daniel had underestimated her intelligence and strength, but his mistake would become her opportunity. Victoria Chen was about to begin the fight of her life, and she intended to win decisively. The fall had been devastating, but it had also provided her with the clarity and motivation necessary to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. The anniversary dinner she had been dreading would ultimately become the night that transformed her from a victim into a victor. Victoria Chen's transformation began not with dramatic confrontations or emotional outbursts, but with the methodical precision that had once made her Columbia Business School's top-ranked student. In the weeks following her devastating anniversary discovery, she became a different version of herself, careful, calculating, and nearly invisible, as she gathered intelligence about the scope of Daniel's deception. Her first strategic decision was to maintain absolute normalcy in their daily interactions. When Daniel finally returned home at 3 in the morning after his missed anniversary dinner, Victoria greeted him with the measured disappointment of a wife accustomed to professional disappointments rather than the rage of someone who had discovered systematic betrayal. Her performance was flawless because it required suppressing emotions that could compromise her investigation. "The restaurant held our table until 11, Victoria said without looking up from her morning coffee as Daniel stumbled into their kitchen the next day. "I hope your client emergency was resolved successfully." Daniel's relief was palpable as he launched into an elaborate explanation about a last-minute crisis involving a major acquisition deal. Victoria listened with apparent sympathy while mentally cataloging the inconsistencies in his story. Her financial background had taught her to identify discrepancies in complex narratives, and Daniel's explanation contained several obvious fabrications. But rather than challenging his lies, Victoria began documenting them. She created encrypted files on a laptop that Daniel had never seen, recording every suspicious conversation, every unexplained absence, and every financial irregularity she could identify through careful observation. Her training as a financial advisor had developed her natural attention to detail, and she applied those skills to studying her husband's behavior patterns with scientific precision. Victoria's professional work provided perfect cover for her investigation. As a financial advisor for high-net-worth families, she had legitimate reasons to research offshore banking practices, asset protection strategies, and corporate shell structures. She began studying these topics with renewed intensity, ostensibly to better serve her clients but actually to understand the mechanisms Daniel had used to hide their assets. Her position at Morrison Wealth Management also provided access to sophisticated financial analysis tools and databases that would have been expensive to obtain privately. Victoria used her office resources to trace the shell companies and offshore accounts she had discovered on the USB drive, building a comprehensive picture of Daniel's financial deception while appearing to conduct routine client research. The work was painstaking and emotionally exhausting. Each new discovery revealed additional layers of betrayal that went back years further than she had initially realized. Daniel had not simply decided to have an affair and steal money in recent years. He had been systematically positioning himself to abandon their marriage while maximizing his financial advantage from almost the beginning of their relationship. Victoria discovered that Daniel had been transferring small amounts from their joint accounts into his private holdings for over 8 years, timing the transfers to coincide with market fluctuations that would make the missing funds appear to be investment losses rather than theft. The sophistication of his approach suggested careful planning and possibly professional advice from attorneys or accountants who specialized in hiding assets from spouses. More troubling was the evidence that Daniel had been undermining Victoria's professional reputation for several years. She found records of conversations where Daniel had suggested to mutual acquaintances that Victoria's career had stagnated because she lacked the intellectual capacity for high-level financial work. He had painted her career compromises as evidence of professional inadequacy rather than personal sacrifices made to support their marriage. But Victoria's investigation also revealed something that Daniel had not anticipated. Her own professional network was far more extensive and influential than he realized. During her years at Morrison Wealth Management, Victoria had developed relationships with attorneys, accountants, private investigators, and other professionals who specialized in protecting clients from exactly the type of fraud Daniel had perpetrated. Victoria began reaching out to these contacts under the guise of seeking advice for hypothetical client situations. She presented Daniel's schemes as case studies involving unnamed individuals, asking for professional opinions about legal remedies and investigative approaches. The responses were uniformly encouraging. The evidence she had discovered would be sufficient to pursue both criminal charges and civil remedies that could result in significant financial penalties for Daniel. More importantly, Victoria learned that her professional reputation was far stronger than Daniel's sabotage attempts had suggested. Colleagues and clients consistently praised her analytical skills, her integrity, and her ability to navigate complex financial challenges. The career limitations she had experienced were not the result of professional inadequacy, but rather the consequence of the compromises she had made to accommodate Daniel's demands. This realization transformed Victoria's understanding of her own capabilities and potential. For years, she had internalized Daniel's subtle criticisms and assumed that her career plateau reflected genuine limitations in her abilities. But as she conducted her investigation with increasing sophistication, she recognized that her analytical skills had actually improved during her years at Morrison Wealth Management. Her work with high-net-worth families had exposed her to complex financial structures and legal strategies that few professionals ever encountered. She had developed expertise in areas that made her uniquely qualified to understand and combat Daniel's deception. The career path she had been pressured to accept had inadvertently prepared her for exactly the type of financial investigation she was now conducting. Victoria's investigation also revealed the extent to which she had been isolated from her own social and professional networks. Daniel had subtly discouraged her from maintaining close friendships with business school classmates who had achieved significant career success. He had suggested that these relationships made Victoria feel inadequate about her own career choices, and he had gradually replaced their social circle with his colleagues and clients, who reinforced his narrative about Victoria's limited professional achievements. But as Victoria began reconnecting with old friends and colleagues under the pretext of seeking career advice, she discovered that many of them had been interested in maintaining closer relationships with her. Several offered professional opportunities that could significantly advance her career if she chose to pursue them. Victoria realized that her professional isolation had been artificially maintained by Daniel's influence, rather than the natural result of career stagnation. One particularly significant reconnection came through Professor Sarah Martinez, Victoria's former corporate finance instructor at Columbia Business School. Professor Martinez had transitioned from academia to managing a boutique investment firm that specialized in forensic financial analysis for legal proceedings. When Victoria contacted her seeking advice about hypothetical fraud cases, Professor Martinez immediately recognized Victoria's exceptional analytical abilities. "Victoria, your questions demonstrate a level of understanding that most practicing attorneys never develop," Professor Martinez said during their phone conversation. "Have you considered specializing in forensic financial analysis? Your background and skills would make you extraordinarily effective in that field." The conversation planted a seed that began growing in Victoria's mind. Forensic financial analysis combined her analytical strengths with her growing expertise in fraud detection. It was also a field where practitioners often worked as independent consultants, providing the professional autonomy that Victoria had sacrificed during her marriage. But perhaps most appealingly, forensic financial analysts frequently worked on cases involving exactly the type of deception Victoria was experiencing. She could transform her personal trauma into professional expertise that would help other victims of financial fraud while building a career that would provide both intellectual satisfaction and financial independence. Victoria began studying forensic accounting principles and legal procedures while continuing her investigation of Daniel's activities. She enrolled in continuing education courses and obtained certifications that would qualify her for expert witness testimony in fraud cases. Her legitimate educational activities provided additional cover for the research techniques she was applying to her personal situation. As Victoria's investigation progressed, she began to see patterns in Daniel's behavior that suggested his current deception was part of a longer history of manipulative relationships. She discovered evidence that Daniel had engaged in similar financial deception during a previous relationship that had ended shortly before he met Victoria. The pattern suggested that Daniel's behavior was not the result of a midlife crisis or temporary moral lapse, but rather a consistent approach to relationships that he viewed primarily as sources of financial and social advantage. This realization helped Victoria understand that Daniel's betrayal was not a reflection of her inadequacy as a wife or partner. She had been targeted precisely because of her intelligence, earning potential, and professional connections. Daniel had recognized her value and had systematically exploited it, while positioning himself to discard her when she was no longer useful to his advancement. The understanding was both liberating and infuriating. Victoria had spent months questioning her own judgment and wondering what she had done to cause the deterioration of their marriage. Now she understood that the marriage had never been the partnership she had believed it to be. Daniel had viewed her as a resource to be exploited, rather than a partner to be cherished. But this clarity also gave Victoria confidence in her ability to respond effectively to Daniel's deception. She had not failed as a wife because the marriage had been built on false premises from the beginning. She did not need to repair a broken relationship because no genuine relationship had ever existed. Her task was not reconciliation, but rather the systematic dismantling of a fraud that had been perpetrated against her for over a decade. Victoria's investigation had also revealed the identity of several other professionals who had been complicit in Daniel's schemes. The private investigators who had been documenting her activities, the attorneys who had advised Daniel on asset protection strategies, and the accountants who had helped establish his offshore holdings could all face professional sanctions or criminal charges if Victoria chose to expose their involvement. This knowledge gave Victoria significant leverage that Daniel did not realize she possessed. She could threaten the professional licenses and reputations of people who had enabled Daniel's fraud, potentially motivating them to cooperate with her rather than continue supporting his deception. More importantly, Victoria realized that her investigation had transformed her from a victim into an expert. She now understood financial fraud techniques that most professionals never encountered. She had developed investigative skills that could be applied to other cases. She had built relationships with attorneys and forensic accountants who could provide ongoing professional opportunities. The woman, who had been systematically undermined and isolated by her husband's manipulation, had emerged as someone with unique expertise and professional connections. Victoria's forced education in fraud detection and asset recovery had prepared her for a career that could provide both personal satisfaction and financial independence, while helping other victims of similar deception. As Victoria prepared to transition from investigation to action, she reflected on the transformation she had experienced over the past several months. The devastating discovery that had shattered her understanding of her marriage had also freed her from limitations that had constrained her potential for years. Victoria Chen was no longer the compromised wife who had sacrificed her ambitions to accommodate her husband's vision of their life together. She had become a formidable investigator with sophisticated knowledge of financial fraud and the professional connections necessary to combat it effectively. The invisible observer was ready to become visible again, but this time with capabilities that Daniel had never anticipated and could not counter. Victoria Chen's methodical investigation had revealed the scope of Daniel's deception, but translating that knowledge into effective action required resources and allies that extended far beyond her individual capabilities. Over the following months, Victoria discovered that her years of professional networking had created relationships with individuals who possessed exactly the expertise she needed to combat sophisticated financial fraud. The first crucial alliance emerged through an unexpected encounter at the quarterly meeting of the Manhattan Financial Advisory Council. Victoria had been attending these professional gatherings for several years, but she had typically focused on technical presentations rather than the informal networking that occurred during breaks and social events. Her investigation of Daniel's activities had heightened her awareness of how much valuable information could be exchanged through casual professional conversations. During the coffee break following a presentation on offshore asset protection strategies, Victoria found herself in conversation with Margaret Torres, a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned to private practice specializing in white-collar criminal defense. Margaret had been observing Victoria's intense focus during the presentation and commented on her unusually sophisticated questions about regulatory compliance and enforcement procedures. "Your questions suggest more than academic interest in asset protection violations," Margaret observed with the directness that had made her effective in federal court. "Are you working on a case that involves these issues?" Victoria had prepared for such inquiries by developing responses that allowed her to discuss her situation without revealing personal details that could compromise her investigation. "I am researching a complex fraud case involving systematic asset concealment and spousal deception. The sophistication of the schemes suggests professional assistance from attorneys and accountants who may have violated their professional obligations." Quote, "But this clarity also gave Victoria confidence in her ability to respond effectively to Daniel's deception. She had not failed as a wife because the marriage had been built on false premises from the beginning. She did not need to repair a broken relationship because no genuine relationship had ever existed. Her task was not reconciliation, but rather the systematic dismantling of a fraud that had been perpetrated against her for over a decade." Victoria's investigation had also revealed the identity of several other professionals who had been complicit in Daniel's schemes. The private investigators who had been documenting her activities, the attorneys who had advised Daniel on asset protection strategies, and the accountants who had helped establish his offshore holdings could all face professional sanctions or criminal charges if Victoria chose to expose their involvement. This knowledge gave Victoria significant leverage that Daniel did not realize she possessed. She could threaten the professional licenses and reputations of people who had enabled Daniel's fraud, potentially motivating them to cooperate with her rather than continue supporting his deception. More importantly, Victoria realized that her investigation had transformed her from a victim into an expert. She now understood financial fraud techniques that most professionals never encountered. She had developed investigative skills that could be applied to other cases. She had built relationships with attorneys and forensic accountants who could provide ongoing professional opportunities. The woman who had been systematically undermined and isolated by her husband's manipulation had emerged as someone with unique expertise and professional connections. Victoria's forced education in fraud detection and asset recovery had prepared her for a career that could provide both personal satisfaction and financial independence, while helping other victims of similar deception. As Victoria prepared to transition from investigation to action, she reflected on the transformation she had experienced over the past several months. The devastating discovery that had shattered her understanding of her marriage had also freed her from limitations that had constrained her potential for years. Victoria Chen was no longer the compromised wife who had sacrificed her ambitions to accommodate her husband's vision of their life together. She had become a formidable investigator, with sophisticated knowledge of financial fraud and the professional connections necessary to combat it effectively. The invisible observer was ready to become visible again, but this time with capabilities that Daniel had never anticipated and could not counter. Victoria Chen's methodical investigation had revealed the scope of Daniel's deception, but translating that knowledge into effective action required resources and allies that extended far beyond her individual capabilities. Over the following months, Victoria discovered that her years of professional networking had created relationships with individuals who possessed exactly the expertise she needed to combat sophisticated financial fraud. The first crucial alliance emerged through an unexpected encounter at the quarterly meeting of the Manhattan Financial Advisory Council. Victoria had been attending these professional gatherings for several years, but she had typically focused on technical presentations rather than the informal networking that occurred during breaks and social events. Her investigation of Daniel's activities had heightened her awareness of how much valuable information could be exchanged through casual professional conversations. During the coffee break following a presentation on offshore asset protection strategies, Victoria found herself in conversation with Margaret Torres, a former federal prosecutor who had transitioned to private practice specializing in white-collar criminal defense. Margaret had been observing Victoria's intense focus during the presentation and commented on her unusually sophisticated questions about regulatory compliance and enforcement procedures. "Your questions suggest more than academic interest in asset protection violations," Margaret observed with the directness that had made her effective in federal court. "Are you working on a case that involves these issues?" Victoria had prepared for such inquiries by developing responses that allowed her to discuss her situation without revealing personal details that could compromise her investigation. "I am researching a complex fraud case involving systematic asset concealment and spousal deception. The sophistication of the scheme suggests professional assistance from attorneys and accountants who may have violated their professional obligations." Margaret's expression sharpened with interest. "How extensive is the documentation you have discovered?" "Comprehensive financial records spanning several years, including offshore accounts, shell company structures, and communications detailing the implementation of asset concealment strategies," Victoria replied, maintaining the clinical tone she had adopted when discussing her personal situation as a professional case study. Margaret handed Victoria her business card with a notation written on the back. "I would be interested in reviewing the evidence you have compiled. If the case involves the level of sophistication you have described, there may be both criminal and civil remedies available that could result in significant financial recovery and professional sanctions for the individuals involved." Victoria recognized that Margaret's interest represented a critical opportunity to transform her individual investigation into a professional legal proceeding with the potential for meaningful consequences. But she also understood that engaging legal counsel would accelerate the timeline for confronting Daniel and would require her to commit fully to pursuing aggressive remedies rather than attempting reconciliation. The decision to contact Margaret Torres marked Victoria's transition from gathering information to building a team of professionals who could help her execute a comprehensive response to Daniel's deception. Margaret's initial review of Victoria's evidence confirmed that Daniel's activities constituted multiple violations of federal and state laws governing financial fraud, tax evasion, and spousal asset concealment. More importantly, Margaret explained that Victoria's methodical documentation had created evidence that would be admissible in both criminal and civil proceedings. Victoria's analytical background had prompted her to preserve chain-of-custody documentation and to verify financial records through independent sources in ways that met legal evidentiary standards. Your investigative approach demonstrates sophisticated understanding of legal evidence requirements, Margaret noted during their first formal consultation. Most individuals who discover financial fraud by spouses make emotional decisions that compromise their ability to pursue legal remedies. Your systematic approach has preserved options that would have been lost through less disciplined investigation. Margaret's validation of Victoria's investigative methods provided confirmation that her analytical skills had enabled her to gather evidence more effectively than most individuals without legal training could have accomplished. The capabilities that Daniel had dismissed as inadequate had actually prepared Victoria to document his crimes with professional-level competence. Margaret also explained that Victoria's position as a financial advisor provided her with professional credibility that would be valuable if the case proceeded to trial. Juries and judges tended to trust financial professionals who discovered fraud through legitimate investigation rather than suspicious spouses who might have motivations to fabricate evidence. But perhaps most significantly, Margaret introduced Victoria to a network of professionals who specialized in cases involving sophisticated financial deception. This network included forensic accountants who could quantify financial damages, private investigators who could gather additional evidence, and asset recovery specialists who could locate and freeze hidden funds before Daniel could move them to additional offshore accounts. Victoria's first meeting with this professional team took place in Margaret Torres's conference room 6 weeks after her initial contact with the attorney. The assembled group included Dr. Richard Kim, a forensic accountant who had testified in several high-profile fraud cases, Patricia Walsh, a private investigator with expertise in offshore financial structures, and James Morrison, an asset recovery specialist who had worked with federal agencies on international fraud cases. The presentation Victoria delivered to this group represented the culmination of months of investigation and analysis. She had prepared a comprehensive overview of Daniel's financial deception that included detailed timelines, quantified financial losses, and evidence of professional misconduct by individuals who had assisted in the schemes. Dr. Kim reviewed Victoria's financial analysis with obvious admiration for her methodology. Your documentation of the asset transfers demonstrates sophisticated understanding of forensic accounting principles. The timeline correlation between market events and transfer activities shows systematic planning that will be difficult for opposing counsel to characterize as innocent financial management. Patricia Walsh was equally impressed by Victoria's investigation of the offshore account structures. You have identified connection points between shell companies that we typically need several months to discover through formal investigation. Your analysis has significantly accelerated the evidence-gathering process. James Morrison's assessment focused on the recovery potential for Victoria's case. The documentation you have compiled provides clear evidence of the location and control mechanisms for the concealed assets. We should be able to freeze the accounts and initiate recovery proceedings before opposing parties can transfer funds to additional jurisdictions. But the most significant development during this meeting was the team's recognition that Victoria's case represented a pattern of financial deception that extended beyond her individual situation. Patricia Walsh's investigation had revealed that several of the professionals who had assisted Daniel in concealing assets had been involved in similar schemes affecting other clients. Dr. Chen, your husband's case appears to be part of a larger network of professionals who have been facilitating spousal asset concealment for wealthy individuals, Patricia explained. The attorneys, accountants, and offshore banking contacts involved in your husband's schemes have been providing similar services to other clients who wanted to hide assets from spouses prior to divorce proceedings. This revelation transformed Victoria's case from an individual fraud matter into part of a potential racketeering investigation that could affect dozens of other victims. Margaret Torres explained that Victoria's evidence could serve as the foundation for a broader investigation that might result in federal prosecution of the entire professional network. Your willingness to pursue this case could provide justice for numerous other victims who may not have discovered the fraud perpetrated against them, Margaret noted. The professional network that enabled your husband's deception has been operating for several years and has likely caused significant financial harm to other spouses who trusted professionals to handle their family finances ethically. Victoria realized that her personal situation had connected her to a broader community of individuals who had experienced similar betrayals. The isolation she had felt during her marriage had been replaced by alignment with other victims who could benefit from her willingness to pursue comprehensive legal remedies. But Victoria's growing network extended beyond legal and investigative professionals. Her reconnection with business school colleagues had revealed that several of her former classmates had achieved positions that could provide additional resources for her case and her future career development. Professor Sarah Martinez had introduced Victoria to Dr. Jennifer Liu, a former Columbia classmate who had established a boutique consulting firm specializing in forensic financial analysis for legal proceedings. Jennifer's firm had been retained by several major law firms to provide expert witness testimony and financial analysis in complex fraud cases. Victoria, your experience with this case has provided you with practical expertise that most forensic financial analysts never develop, Jennifer explained during their lunch meeting at a restaurant near Columbia's campus. You have lived through the victim experience while simultaneously conducting professional-level investigation. That combination of perspectives would be extremely valuable for our client work. Jennifer offered Victoria a position as a senior consultant with her firm, providing both immediate income replacement and long-term career opportunities that would utilize Victoria's unique combination of financial expertise and fraud investigation experience. The position would allow Victoria to work on cases similar to her own while building a professional reputation in forensic financial analysis. But perhaps more importantly, Jennifer's offer represented validation that Victoria's analytical capabilities had not been diminished by her years of career compromise. The skills that Daniel had dismissed as inadequate were actually in high demand among professionals who worked on the most complex financial fraud cases. Victoria's expanding professional network also included Dr. Michael Chang, another Columbia classmate who had become a managing director at a major investment bank. Michael's perspective on Victoria's case focused on the broader implications for the financial services industry. Victoria, what you have uncovered suggests systematic abuse of client trust by financial professionals who should be held to the highest ethical standards, Michael observed. The investment banking community needs to understand that this type of misconduct damages the reputation of the entire industry. Quote, Michael offered to connect Victoria with regulatory officials and industry organizations that could pursue professional sanctions against the individuals who had assisted Daniel in concealing assets. These sanctions could include loss of professional licenses, exclusion from industry associations, and public censure that would prevent the perpetrators from continuing their fraudulent activities. Victoria's network expansion also revealed opportunities for personal growth and development that extended beyond her professional career. Dr. Lisa Park, a psychologist who specialized in counseling victims of financial abuse, had been recommended by Margaret Torres as someone who could help Victoria process the emotional impact of discovering systematic deception by someone she had trusted completely. Dr. Park's approach emphasized empowerment rather than victimization, helping Victoria understand that her response to Daniel's betrayal demonstrated remarkable strength and competence rather than naivete or failure. The therapy sessions provided Victoria with tools for managing the stress of legal proceedings while maintaining her professional effectiveness and personal well-being. Victoria, your ability to conduct systematic investigation while maintaining emotional stability demonstrates exceptional resilience, Dr. Park noted during one of their sessions. Many individuals who discover this type of betrayal become overwhelmed by anger or depression that prevents them from taking effective action. Your methodical approach suggests that you have transformed trauma into motivation for constructive change. Dr. Park also connected Victoria with support groups for individuals who had experienced financial abuse by spouses or partners. These groups provided Victoria with additional perspective on her situation, while allowing her to share insights that could help other victims pursue effective remedies. Victoria discovered that her analytical approach to investigating financial fraud had created methods that other victims could adapt to their own situations. Her systematic documentation techniques and professional networking strategies provided templates that could be applied by individuals with different educational backgrounds and career experiences. As Victoria's network of allies expanded, she began to see herself not just as a victim seeking justice for personal wrongs, but as someone who could contribute to broader efforts to combat financial fraud and support other victims of similar deception. Her individual case had connected her to a community of professionals and advocates who were working to address systemic problems in the financial services industry. The underground network Victoria had built provided her with more than just professional resources for pursuing legal remedies against Daniel. It had connected her to opportunities for career advancement, personal growth, and meaningful contribution to causes that extended beyond her individual situation. Victoria Chen had transformed from an isolated wife whose professional capabilities had been systematically undermined into a central figure in a network of accomplished professionals who recognized and valued her unique combination of analytical skills and practical experience. The investigation that had begun as a desperate response to personal betrayal had evolved into the foundation for a career that could provide both financial independence and professional satisfaction while helping other victims of similar fraud. The underground network was no longer hidden. Victoria had emerged as a visible and valued member of professional communities that could provide ongoing support for her career development and personal growth. The woman who had been made invisible by her husband's manipulation had become someone whose expertise and insights were actively sought by other professionals who recognized the value of her unique perspective and capabilities. Victoria Chen's carefully constructed network of professional allies faced its first major test when Margaret Torres received an urgent call from a potential client whose situation mirrored Victoria's experience in disturbing ways. The case would demonstrate whether Victoria's analytical methods and investigative insights could be successfully applied to help other victims of sophisticated financial fraud. The client was Dr. Amanda Richardson, a successful cardiac surgeon whose husband had recently disappeared, along with significant assets from their joint investment accounts. Amanda had discovered the theft when attempting to transfer funds for a real estate investment, only to learn that accounts containing over $2 million had been systematically emptied over the preceding 6 months. Amanda's initial consultation with Margaret Torres revealed financial deception that appeared to follow patterns remarkably similar to those Victoria had uncovered in Daniel's schemes. The missing funds had been transferred through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts that masked the ultimate destination of the assets. Amanda's husband had used sophisticated legal and financial structures to conceal his activities while maintaining the appearance of normal marital financial management. Margaret recognized that Amanda's case could benefit significantly from Victoria's expertise, but she also understood that involving Victoria would represent a crucial test of whether the analytical methods developed during her personal investigation could be applied effectively to other complex fraud cases. "Victoria, I believe your insights could be instrumental in helping Dr. Richardson recover her assets," Margaret explained during their phone conversation. "But I want you to understand that this would represent your first professional engagement as a forensic financial consultant, rather than a victim conducting personal investigation." Victoria understood the significance of Margaret's invitation. Accepting the engagement would formally establish her transition from fraud victim to professional expert, but it would also require her to demonstrate that her investigative capabilities could produce results for clients rather than solely for her personal case. The prospect was both exciting and intimidating. Victoria had developed confidence in her ability to analyze financial records and identify fraudulent patterns, but she had never applied those skills under the pressure of professional expectations and client deadlines. Success would validate her career transition and establish her credibility as a forensic consultant, while failure could undermine her professional reputation before it was fully established. Victoria accepted the engagement with the understanding that she would work under Margaret's supervision and would collaborate closely with Dr. Kim and the other members of their professional team. The arrangement provided her with appropriate oversight, while allowing her to take primary responsibility for the financial analysis components of the case. Victoria's first meeting with Dr. Richardson took place in Margaret Torres's conference room on a Tuesday morning in late March. Amanda Richardson was a composed, articulate woman in her early 40s, whose professional demeanor reflected years of making critical decisions under pressure in surgical environments. But Victoria could see the underlying stress and betrayal that Amanda was struggling to manage while maintaining her demanding medical practice. Dr. Richardson, I want you to understand that I have recently experienced a situation very similar to yours, Victoria began, establishing the personal connection that would differentiate her approach from that of traditional forensic consultants. While every case has unique characteristics, the emotional and practical challenges you are facing are ones that I understand from direct experience. Amanda's relief at speaking with someone who had navigated similar circumstances was immediately apparent. Dr. Chen, the financial advisors and attorneys I have consulted treat this as a technical problem to be solved, but they do not seem to understand the personal devastation of discovering that someone you trusted completely has been systematically deceiving you for years. Victoria recognized the isolation and self-doubt that Amanda was experiencing, emotions that Victoria herself had worked through with Dr. Park's guidance. But she also understood that Amanda needed more than emotional support. She needed professional expertise that could produce concrete results in asset recovery and legal accountability. Victoria's analysis of Amanda's financial records began with the systematic approach she had developed during her own investigation. She created detailed timelines of asset transfers, identified patterns in transaction timing and amounts, and traced the flow of funds through various corporate entities and banking relationships. But Victoria's approach differed from traditional forensic accounting methods in significant ways. Her personal experience with financial deception had taught her to look for specific indicators that might not be apparent to consultants who had only studied fraud from theoretical perspectives. Victoria focused particularly on transfers that coincided with Amanda's professional travel schedule, recognizing that perpetrators often timed their activities to periods when victims would be distracted by other responsibilities. She also analyzed communication patterns between Amanda and her husband, identifying periods when his behavior had been designed to deflect attention from financial activities. Within the first week of analysis, Victoria identified discrepancies in Amanda's case that had been missed by previous consultants. The pattern of asset transfers suggested coordination with Amanda's surgical schedule that indicated her husband had been planning the fraud for far longer than the 6-month period when the transfers had occurred. Victoria discovered evidence that Amanda's husband had been moving smaller amounts from their accounts for over 2 years, using market volatility to mask the transfers as investment losses rather than theft. The sophisticated timing and concealment methods suggested professional assistance from individuals with expertise in offshore banking and asset protection strategies. More significantly, Victoria's analysis revealed that the shell companies used to conceal Amanda's assets had been established by the same offshore banking network that had assisted Daniel in his schemes. The discovery suggested that both cases were connected to a broader pattern of financial fraud, facilitated by professionals who specialized in helping clients conceal assets from spouses. Victoria presented her initial findings to Margaret Torres and Dr. Kim in a comprehensive report that demonstrated both analytical rigor and practical insight into the methods used to perpetrate the fraud. Her documentation met professional standards for forensic analysis while providing actionable intelligence for asset recovery efforts. Victoria, your analysis has identified connection points that we had not previously recognized, Dr. Kim observed after reviewing her report. The correlation between transaction timing and the victim's professional schedule provides evidence of premeditation that will be valuable for both criminal prosecution and civil recovery efforts. Margaret Torres was equally impressed by Victoria's work. Your approach combines technical analysis with practical understanding of victim psychology and perpetrator behavior patterns. That combination provides insights that pure technical analysis often misses. But the most significant validation came from the results Victoria's analysis produced. Patricia Walsh used Victoria's findings to trace Amanda's assets to offshore accounts in jurisdictions that had cooperative agreements with United States law enforcement agencies. James Morrison initiated asset freezing procedures that prevented additional transfers while recovery proceedings were developed. Within 6 weeks of Victoria's engagement on the case, the team had located and frozen over $1.8 million of Amanda's assets that had been concealed in offshore accounts. The recovery represented approximately 90% of the funds that had been stolen, a result that exceeded the expectations of all parties involved. Amanda Richardson's response to the asset recovery validated Victoria's decision to pursue forensic consulting as a career path. Dr. Chin, your work has not only recovered my financial assets but has restored my confidence in my ability to protect myself from future deception, Amanda said during their final meeting. Your understanding of both the technical and emotional aspects of financial fraud made the difference between feeling victimized and feeling empowered. But Victoria's success on Amanda's case produced implications that extended beyond individual client satisfaction. Word of the successful asset recovery spread through Margaret Torres's professional network, generating inquiries from other attorneys who had clients facing similar challenges. Within 2 months of completing Amanda's case, Victoria had received consulting requests from attorneys representing victims of financial fraud in 3 different states. The cases involved varying levels of complexity, but all shared characteristics that suggested coordination among professionals who specialized in concealing assets from spouses or business partners. Victoria's growing caseload validated her decision to accept Jennifer Liu's offer to join her forensic consulting firm as a senior associate. The position provided Victoria with administrative support, professional liability insurance, and access to sophisticated analytical tools, while allowing her to focus on client work rather than business development activities. But perhaps more importantly, Victoria's success demonstrated that her analytical capabilities had not been diminished by her years of career compromise. The skills that Daniel had dismissed as inadequate were actually highly valued by legal professionals who worked on the most complex fraud cases. Victoria's unique combination of technical expertise and personal experience with financial deception made her particularly effective at identifying patterns and developing strategies that other consultants might miss. Victoria's professional transformation also created opportunities to contribute to broader efforts to combat financial fraud. Dr. Michael Chang introduced her to regulatory officials at the Securities and Exchange Commission, who were investigating patterns of professional misconduct in asset protection services. Victoria's casework had identified several attorneys and accountants whose activities appeared to violate professional ethical standards and possibly federal regulations governing financial services. Victoria's testimony before SEC investigators provided evidence that supported enforcement actions against professionals who had been facilitating spousal asset concealment for multiple clients. Her detailed documentation of fraudulent methods and professional networks gave regulators the information they needed to pursue sanctions that could prevent future victims from experiencing similar fraud. The regulatory engagement also established Victoria's credibility as an expert witness in cases involving sophisticated financial deception. Her combination of professional credentials, analytical expertise, and direct experience with fraud made her testimony particularly compelling for judges and juries who needed to understand complex financial schemes. Victoria's first expert witness engagement came through Margaret Torres's recommendation to a federal prosecutor who was pursuing criminal charges against a network of professionals who had been facilitating tax evasion and spousal asset concealment for wealthy clients. Victoria's analysis of the defendant's methods provided evidence that helped secure convictions and significant financial penalties. But Victoria's most meaningful professional breakthrough came when Professor Sarah Martinez invited her to present a guest lecture at Columbia Business School on forensic financial analysis methods for detecting sophisticated fraud. The invitation represented recognition that Victoria had developed expertise that could benefit the next generation of financial professionals. Victoria's presentation to Martinez's corporate finance class focused on practical methods for identifying financial deception in complex corporate and personal financial structures. She emphasized the importance of systematic documentation, pattern recognition, and understanding the psychological factors that motivate financial fraud. The student response to Victoria's presentation was overwhelmingly positive, with several students expressing interest in forensic financial analysis as a career path. Victoria realized that her experience had created knowledge that could help other professionals develop skills for combating financial fraud while building personally fulfilling careers. Victoria's return to Columbia as a recognized expert, rather than a struggling alumna seeking advice, represented the full completion of her professional transformation. The woman who had been systematically undermined and isolated by her husband's manipulation had become someone whose expertise was actively sought by attorneys, regulators, and academic institutions. But Victoria understood that her breakthrough success resulted from more than just analytical skills or professional networking. Her willingness to transform personal trauma into professional expertise had created capabilities that would not have been possible through traditional career development. The devastating discovery of Daniel's betrayal had ultimately redirected her toward a career that provided both financial independence and meaningful contribution to combating problems that affected numerous other victims. Victoria Chen had proven that sophisticated analytical capabilities, when combined with determination and strategic professional networking, could overcome even the most systematic attempts at personal and professional destruction. Her first major breakthrough had established the foundation for a career that would provide ongoing opportunities for growth, contribution, and personal satisfaction, while helping other victims transform their own experiences of betrayal into sources of strength and expertise. Victoria Chen's successful resolution of Dr. Amanda Richardson's case established her credibility within the forensic financial consulting community and generated recognition that extended far beyond her initial professional network. The comprehensive asset recovery and the sophisticated analytical methods Victoria had employed created a reputation that attracted attention from legal professionals, regulatory agencies, and academic institutions seeking expertise in complex financial fraud investigations. The first significant recognition came through an invitation from the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants to present her forensic analysis methodology at their annual conference on fraud examination. The presentation opportunity represented validation from the accounting profession's premier organization that Victoria's innovative approach to financial fraud detection warranted broader dissemination throughout the professional community. Victoria's preparation for the AICPA presentation required her to formalize the analytical methods she had developed through practical application rather than academic study. The process of creating educational materials from her investigative techniques forced Victoria to articulate the theoretical foundations underlying her practical successes and to develop frameworks that other professionals could adapt to their own casework. The methodology Victoria presented emphasized the integration of traditional forensic accounting techniques with behavioral analysis and pattern recognition strategies derived from her direct experience with sophisticated financial deception. Her approach incorporated understanding of victim psychology, perpetrator motivation, and the operational characteristics of professional networks that facilitated complex fraud schemes. Victoria's presentation to the AICPA conference addressed an audience of over 500 certified public accountants, forensic specialists, and legal professionals who worked on white-collar crime investigations. The response demonstrated significant interest in Victoria's methods, particularly her emphasis on analyzing the timing of fraudulent transactions in relation to victim behavioral patterns and professional responsibilities. Dr. Robert Chen, the conference keynote speaker and a nationally recognized expert in forensic accounting, approached Victoria following her presentation with an observation that would significantly influence her career trajectory. Dr. Chen, your methodology represents a substantial advancement in forensic analysis because it incorporates victim experience as an analytical tool rather than simply an emotional consideration, he noted. Traditional forensic accounting focuses primarily on transaction analysis, but your approach recognizes that understanding victim circumstances provides critical insight into perpetrator methods and timing. Dr. Robert Chen's endorsement of Victoria's methodology carried considerable weight within the forensic accounting community because of his extensive experience testifying in federal court and his role in developing industry standards for fraud investigation procedures. His recommendation led to consulting opportunities with law firms that specialized in complex white-collar crime defense and prosecution. Victoria's growing professional reputation also attracted attention from academic institutions that sought to incorporate practical fraud investigation experience into their curricula. Professor Martinez's initial invitation to guest lecture at Columbia Business School led to similar opportunities at New York University's Stern School of Business and Fordham University's Graduate School of Business Administration. These academic engagements allowed Victoria to share her expertise with graduate students who were preparing for careers in financial analysis, forensic accounting, and legal practice. The presentations also provided Victoria with opportunities to refine her analytical methods through academic feedback and to develop research questions that could advance the broader understanding of financial fraud detection and prevention. Victoria's academic involvement led to collaboration with Dr. Sarah Kim, a professor of behavioral economics at NYU, who was researching the psychological factors that enabled sophisticated financial fraud. Dr. Kim's research focused on the cognitive biases and social dynamics that prevented fraud victims from recognizing deception even when objective evidence was available. The collaboration between Victoria and Dr. Kim produced a research paper that analyzed the behavioral patterns of financial fraud perpetrators and their victims, using Victoria's casework as the empirical foundation for broader theoretical insights. The paper demonstrated how understanding victim psychology could improve fraud detection methods and could help financial professionals identify clients who might be at risk for sophisticated deception. The research collaboration also provided Victoria with academic credentials that enhanced her expert witness qualifications and established her credibility for testifying in complex fraud cases that required explanation of perpetrator behavior patterns and victim response mechanisms. Victoria's expert witness work expanded significantly following the publication of her research with Dr. Kim. Federal prosecutors began consulting with Victoria on cases involving sophisticated financial fraud that required juries to understand complex behavioral dynamics in addition to technical financial analysis. Victoria's ability to explain both the analytical methods used to detect fraud and the psychological factors that enabled the deception made her testimony particularly effective in securing convictions. Victoria's first major federal testimony occurred in a case involving a financial advisor who had stolen over $15 million from elderly clients through systematic manipulation of their trust and confidence. The defense strategy attempted to characterize the clients as willing participants who had understood the risks of the investments that resulted in their financial losses. Victoria's testimony demonstrated how the defendant had used sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques to gain client trust while concealing the fraudulent nature of the investment schemes. Her analysis of the defendant's communication patterns and transaction timing provided evidence that the fraud had been carefully planned and executed, rather than the result of legitimate investment decisions that had produced unexpected losses. The jury's guilty verdict on all counts validated Victoria's analytical approach and established her reputation as an expert witness who could effectively communicate complex financial and psychological concepts to lay audiences. The successful testimony led to additional expert witness opportunities in cases involving similar patterns of financial deception and victim manipulation. Victoria's professional recognition also created opportunities for policy influence that extended beyond individual casework. The Securities and Exchange Commission invited Victoria to participate in a regulatory working group that was developing new guidelines for detecting and preventing financial advisor misconduct. Victoria's practical experience with sophisticated fraud methods provided insights that complemented the regulatory expertise of other working group members. The SEC Working Group produced recommendations for enhanced supervision and monitoring of financial professionals who had access to client assets and personal information. Victoria's contributions emphasized the importance of understanding behavioral warning signs that preceded financial fraud and the need for training programs that helped compliance officers recognize patterns of client manipulation and asset concealment. Victoria's policy work with the SEC led to similar consulting opportunities with state regulatory agencies that were developing fraud prevention programs for licensed financial professionals. Her expertise in analyzing perpetrator behavior patterns and victim response mechanisms informed training materials that helped regulatory investigators identify potential misconduct before significant client losses occurred. The regulatory consulting work also connected Victoria with law enforcement agencies that were investigating organized networks of professionals who facilitated sophisticated financial fraud. Victoria's analysis of the professional networks that had enabled Daniel's schemes provided valuable intelligence for federal investigations targeting similar criminal organizations. Victoria's law enforcement consulting revealed that the professional network involved in her personal case was part of a much larger criminal enterprise that had been facilitating tax evasion, money laundering, and spousal asset concealment for wealthy clients across multiple states. Her detailed documentation of the methods and relationships within this network provided evidence that supported federal racketeering charges against several attorneys, accountants, and offshore banking specialists. The federal investigation also led to asset forfeiture proceedings that recovered millions of dollars that had been stolen from fraud victims over several years. Victoria's analytical methods were instrumental in tracing the flow of funds through complex offshore structures and identifying assets that could be recovered for distribution to victims. Victoria's involvement in the federal investigation demonstrated the broader impact that individual fraud cases could have when they were pursued with sufficient analytical rigor and professional support. Her willingness to document and report the professional misconduct she had discovered had contributed to law enforcement efforts that protected numerous other potential victims from similar fraud. The success of the federal investigation also provided Victoria with recognition from law enforcement agencies that valued her unique combination of analytical expertise and practical fraud experience. The Federal Bureau of Investigation invited Victoria to participate in training programs for agents who investigated white-collar crime, sharing her insights into perpetrator behavior patterns and fraud detection methods. Victoria's FBI training involvement led to consulting opportunities with other federal agencies that investigated financial crime, including the Internal Revenue Service's Criminal Investigation Division and the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. These engagements established Victoria as a recognized expert in federal law enforcement circles and provided her with additional credentials for expert witness testimony in complex criminal cases. Victoria's expanding recognition within law enforcement and regulatory communities also attracted attention from private sector organizations that sought to improve their fraud prevention capabilities. Major financial institutions began consulting with Victoria to enhance their internal controls and employee training programs, recognizing that her understanding of sophisticated fraud methods could help them identify and prevent similar schemes affecting their clients. Victoria's corporate consulting work focused on developing training programs that helped financial professionals recognize behavioral warning signs that preceded sophisticated fraud attempts. Her programs emphasized the importance of understanding client psychology and communication patterns, rather than relying solely on transaction monitoring and compliance procedures. The corporate training programs Victoria developed were particularly effective because they incorporated real case examples that demonstrated how sophisticated perpetrators exploited psychological vulnerabilities and professional relationships to facilitate their schemes. The training helped financial professionals understand that fraud prevention required psychological insight in addition to technical knowledge of financial regulations and procedures. Victoria's corporate consulting success led to additional opportunities with professional organizations that sought to improve ethical standards and fraud prevention practices within their industries. Bar associations, accounting societies, and financial planning organizations engaged Victoria to develop continuing education programs that addressed the professional obligations and ethical considerations involved in preventing client fraud. These professional development programs established Victoria as a thought leader in forensic financial analysis and fraud prevention education. Her unique combination of practical investigation experience, academic research credentials, and expert witness effectiveness made her particularly valuable for organizations that sought to enhance their members' capabilities for detecting and preventing sophisticated financial deception. Victoria's professional recognition culminated in an invitation to join the board of directors of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, the premier professional organization for individuals who specialized in fraud prevention, detection, and investigation. The board appointment recognized Victoria's contributions to advancing forensic analysis methodology and her effectiveness in training other professionals to combat sophisticated financial fraud. The board position provided Victoria with opportunities to influence professional standards and educational requirements for certified fraud examiners, while connecting her with other recognized experts who were advancing the field through research, education, and practical application. The appointment also established Victoria's credibility as a senior professional whose expertise was valued by the broader fraud examination community. Victoria's transformation from fraud victim to recognized expert had been completed through systematic professional development that converted personal trauma into specialized expertise, valued by legal, regulatory, academic, and corporate communities. Her willingness to share her analytical methods and practical insights had created recognition that extended far beyond individual casework to influence policy development, law enforcement training, and professional education programs. The recognition Victoria had achieved validated her decision to pursue forensic financial consulting as a career path, while demonstrating that her analytical capabilities had not been diminished by her years of career compromise. The expertise that Daniel had dismissed as inadequate had become the foundation for a professional reputation that commanded respect from the most sophisticated practitioners in her field. Victoria Chen's emergence as a recognized authority in forensic financial analysis presented opportunities that extended far beyond individual consulting engagements and expert witness testimony. The professional recognition she had achieved through methodical casework and strategic relationship building now required comprehensive planning to maximize her impact while establishing sustainable foundations for long-term career growth and industry influence. The strategic planning process began during a reflective weekend at Victoria's newly purchased home in Westchester County, a property that represented both her financial recovery and her professional transformation. The house provided the space and tranquility necessary for developing a comprehensive vision that would guide her career decisions and professional investments over the following decade. Victoria's strategic assessment began with a thorough analysis of the professional landscape within which she now operated. The forensic financial analysis industry was experiencing significant growth due to increasing regulatory scrutiny of financial services and growing awareness of sophisticated fraud methods among legal professionals and law enforcement agencies. However, the field remained fragmented, with practitioners operating independently rather than collaborating to advance common standards and methodologies. Victoria recognized that her unique combination of practical fraud experience, analytical expertise, and professional recognition positioned her to address several critical gaps within the forensic analysis community. Traditional practitioners typically specialized in either technical financial analysis or expert witness testimony, but few possessed the breadth of experience necessary to influence policy development, training standards, and industry best practices simultaneously. Victoria's strategic vision centered on establishing herself as a bridge between the various communities that addressed financial fraud, including legal professionals, law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, academic institutions, and private sector organizations. Her role would involve translating insights and methodologies across professional boundaries while advancing the overall effectiveness of fraud prevention and detection efforts. The first component of Victoria's strategic plan focused on expanding her academic involvement to establish a more substantial research foundation for her practical methodologies. While her collaboration with Dr. Sarah Kim had produced valuable insights into the behavioral aspects of financial fraud, Victoria recognized that sustained academic engagement would require more comprehensive research programs that could influence both practical applications and theoretical understanding of forensic analysis. Victoria approached Dr. Jennifer Martinez with a proposal to establish a joint research initiative between Columbia Business School and New York University that would focus on developing evidence-based methodologies for detecting sophisticated financial fraud. The proposed research center would combine Victoria's practical case experience with academic research capabilities to produce studies that could inform professional training programs, regulatory policy development, and law enforcement procedures. Dr. Martinez responded enthusiastically to Victoria's proposal, recognizing that the research center would enhance both institutions' capabilities for addressing emerging challenges in financial crime investigation. The initiative would also provide graduate students with access to real-world case studies and practical training opportunities that were typically unavailable through traditional academic programs. The Columbia-NYU Financial Fraud Research Center received initial funding through grants from the Department of Justice and the Securities and Exchange Commission, agencies that recognize the value of academic research for improving law enforcement and regulatory effectiveness. The center's research agenda emphasized developing technological tools for fraud detection, training methodologies for financial professionals, and policy recommendations for preventing sophisticated financial deception. Victoria's role as the center's executive director provided her with a platform for influencing academic research priorities, while maintaining her consulting practice and expert witness activities. The position also established her credibility within academic circles and created opportunities for publishing research that would advance the theoretical foundations underlying practical fraud detection methods. The second component of Victoria's strategic plan involved expanding her influence within professional organizations to shape industry standards and certification requirements for forensic financial analysts. Victoria's appointment to the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners Board had provided her with insights into the challenges facing professional development within the fraud examination field. Victoria observed that certification requirements for forensic financial analysts emphasized technical skills and regulatory knowledge but provided limited training in the behavioral analysis and pattern recognition capabilities that were crucial for detecting sophisticated fraud. Traditional certification programs also failed to address the psychological dynamics that enabled perpetrators to exploit victim trust, and that prevented victims from recognizing deception even when objective evidence was available. Victoria proposed developing advanced certification programs that would incorporate behavioral analysis, psychological insight, and victim advocacy training into traditional forensic accounting curricula. The enhanced certification would prepare professionals to address not only the technical aspects of fraud investigation, but also the human factors that determined investigation success and victim recovery outcomes. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners endorsed Victoria's proposal and provided funding for developing the Advanced Certified Fraud Specialist designation, a credential that would require completion of behavioral analysis training, victim advocacy education, and practical casework under supervision from experienced practitioners. Victoria's role in designing the certification program established her influence over professional development standards while creating opportunities for training the next generation of forensic specialists. The third strategic component focused on leveraging Victoria's law enforcement relationships to enhance federal and state capabilities for investigating organized financial fraud networks. Victoria's work with the FBI and other federal agencies had revealed significant gaps in interagency coordination and information sharing that limited the effectiveness of investigations targeting sophisticated criminal organizations. Victoria proposed establishing a financial fraud intelligence center that would serve as a coordination hub for federal and state agencies investigating complex financial crimes. The center would maintain databases of known perpetrator networks, standardized analytical tools for tracing asset flows, and training programs for law enforcement personnel who specialized in white-collar crime investigation. The Department of Justice provided initial funding for the Intelligence Center based on Victoria's successful contributions to federal investigations and her demonstrated understanding of the operational challenges facing law enforcement agencies. Victoria's role as the center's founding director positioned her to influence federal policy while expanding her network of relationships within law enforcement and regulatory communities. The Intelligence Center's research capabilities also supported Victoria's academic work by providing access to anonymized case data that could inform research studies without compromising ongoing investigations. The synergy between Victoria's academic, professional, and law enforcement activities created opportunities for comprehensive approaches to fraud prevention that addressed policy, training, and enforcement considerations simultaneously. Victoria's strategic planning also addressed the challenge of scaling her individual consulting practice to maximize impact while maintaining the quality and effectiveness that had established her professional reputation. Rather than simply expanding her client base, Victoria focused on developing training programs and analytical tools that would enable other professionals to apply her methodologies more broadly. Victoria established the Chen Institute for Financial Integrity, a training organization that provided comprehensive education programs for attorneys, accountants, financial advisors, and law enforcement personnel who needed enhanced capabilities for detecting and investigating sophisticated financial fraud. The Institute's programs emphasized practical application of analytical methods through case-based learning and supervised investigation exercises. The Institute's flagship program was an intensive training course that provided participants with hands-on experience applying Victoria's analytical methods to complex fraud cases. The program included instruction in behavioral analysis, pattern recognition, asset tracing techniques, and victim advocacy approaches that addressed both the technical and human aspects of financial fraud investigation. The training programs generated significant demand from legal professionals, corporate compliance officers, and government agencies that recognized the value of enhanced fraud detection capabilities. The Institute's reputation for practical, effective training attracted participants from across the United States and internationally, establishing Victoria's influence within the global community of financial crime professionals. Victoria's strategic vision also encompassed policy advocacy that would address the systemic factors that enabled sophisticated financial fraud to flourish within existing regulatory and legal frameworks. Her experience with multiple fraud cases had revealed consistent patterns of professional misconduct and regulatory gaps that allowed perpetrators to exploit victims repeatedly without facing meaningful consequences. Victoria began working with congressional staff members who were developing legislation to strengthen penalties for financial professionals who facilitated fraud and to enhance victim protection measures within existing financial regulations. Her policy advocacy emphasized the need for mandatory reporting requirements that would prevent professionals from assisting multiple clients in concealing assets without triggering regulatory scrutiny. Victoria's congressional testimony on proposed financial fraud legislation demonstrated her ability to translate complex analytical insights into policy recommendations that could be implemented through existing regulatory frameworks. Her testimony emphasized the economic impact of sophisticated financial fraud and the effectiveness of enhanced detection and prevention measures for protecting both individual victims and broader financial system stability. The policy advocacy work established Victoria's credibility within political circles, while creating opportunities for influencing federal legislation that could prevent future victims from experiencing the type of systematic deception that had devastated her own life. Victoria's transformation from fraud victim to policy advocate demonstrated how individual experiences could inform broader efforts to address systemic problems affecting numerous other potential victims. Victoria's comprehensive strategic plan also addressed personal considerations that would enable her to sustain intensive professional activity while maintaining the emotional stability and intellectual clarity necessary for continued effectiveness. The psychological demands of working extensively with fraud cases and victim advocacy required careful attention to stress management and personal support systems. Victoria continued her therapeutic work with Dr. Lisa Park, while also developing relationships with other professionals who understood the unique challenges facing individuals who had transformed personal trauma into professional expertise. The support network provided Victoria with perspective and emotional resources necessary for maintaining effectiveness, while working extensively with other victims of financial deception. Victoria's strategic planning process culminated in the establishment of clear goals and metrics that would guide her professional decisions and enable her to assess progress toward her long-term objectives. The goals encompassed expanding her influence within academic, professional, law enforcement, and policy communities, while maintaining the quality and effectiveness of her individual consulting practice. The comprehensive strategy Victoria developed represented a systematic approach to leveraging professional recognition for maximum impact across multiple communities and constituencies. Rather than focusing narrowly on individual career advancement, Victoria's strategy emphasized creating institutional changes that would enhance fraud prevention and detection capabilities while supporting other victims of financial deception. Victoria's strategic formation demonstrated how individual expertise developed through adversity could be systematically leveraged to create broader institutional impact and societal benefit. The planning process transformed Victoria's professional recognition into a platform for influencing policy, training standards, research priorities, and law enforcement capabilities that would protect numerous other potential victims from experiencing similar fraud. The strategy provided Victoria with a roadmap for transitioning from recognized expert to institutional leader, whose influence would extend far beyond individual casework to shape the broader professional landscape within which financial fraud prevention and detection occurred. Victoria Chen had evolved from victim to expert to strategic leader, whose vision would guide industry development and policy formation for years to come. Victoria Chen's comprehensive strategic framework faced its most significant validation when she received an unexpected proposal from the International Association of Financial Crimes Investigators, a consortium of law enforcement agencies regulatory bodies, and private sector organizations from 12 countries that coordinated efforts to combat sophisticated international financial fraud. The association's executive director, Catherine Morrison, had been following Victoria's work through her publications with the Columbia NYU Financial Fraud Research Center and her testimony before congressional committees addressing international financial crime legislation. Morrison recognized that Victoria's analytical methodologies and institutional relationships positioned her uniquely to address a challenge that had been frustrating international law enforcement efforts for several years. Morrison's initial contact with Victoria occurred during the annual International Financial Crimes Conference in Geneva, where Victoria had been invited to present her research on behavioral patterns in sophisticated fraud networks. Following Victoria's presentation, Morrison approached her with a proposal that would test whether Victoria's strategic vision could produce results on an international scale with multiple institutional partners. The challenge involved a coordinated investigation targeting a criminal network that had been facilitating tax evasion, money laundering, and asset concealment for wealthy clients across multiple jurisdictions. The network operated through a sophisticated web of offshore banking relationships, shell companies, and professional service providers that made traditional law enforcement approaches ineffective due to jurisdictional limitations and information sharing constraints. Morrison explained that previous investigations had been hampered by the inability of individual agencies to develop comprehensive understanding of the network's operations and client relationships. Each jurisdiction could identify fragments of the criminal enterprise, but no single agency possessed the analytical capabilities or institutional relationships necessary to coordinate a comprehensive response that could dismantle the entire operation. Victoria recognized that the international investigation presented an opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of her strategic approach, while addressing exactly the type of sophisticated criminal network that had enabled Daniel's fraud and threatened numerous other potential victims. The investigation would require coordinating analytical methodologies, institutional relationships, and policy frameworks across multiple countries with different legal systems and regulatory structures. Victoria's acceptance of the partnership required negotiating complex arrangements that would allow her to maintain her existing institutional commitments while taking on significant new responsibilities for coordinating international law enforcement efforts. The negotiations also established precedents for academic-government partnerships that could influence future collaborative investigations targeting sophisticated financial crimes. The partnership agreement designated Victoria as the lead analytical coordinator for the international investigation, with responsibility for developing integrated analytical methodologies that could be applied consistently across different jurisdictions. Victoria's role also included training law enforcement personnel from participating countries in her behavioral analysis techniques and coordinating information-sharing protocols that would enable comprehensive understanding of the criminal network's operations. Victoria's first task involved conducting a comprehensive assessment of the investigative capabilities and information resources available within each participating jurisdiction. The assessment revealed significant variations in analytical sophistication, technological capabilities, and legal frameworks that would need to be addressed before effective coordination could be achieved. Victoria developed standardized training programs that provided investigators from all participating countries with common analytical frameworks and technical capabilities for identifying and tracing sophisticated financial fraud. The training emphasized practical application of pattern recognition techniques, behavioral analysis methods, and asset tracing procedures that could be adapted to different legal and regulatory environments. The training programs also established communication protocols and information sharing procedures that enabled investigators to coordinate their efforts without compromising the confidentiality requirements or jurisdictional limitations that govern their individual investigations. Victoria's role as coordinator allowed her to maintain comprehensive oversight of the investigation's progress, while ensuring that each participating agency could pursue remedies appropriate to their legal frameworks. Victoria's analytical coordination revealed that the criminal network under investigation was significantly more extensive than any individual jurisdiction had previously understood. The network included over 200 professional service providers operating in 15 countries, with client relationships that involved systematic tax evasion and asset concealment affecting thousands of victims and billions of dollars in concealed assets. The scope of the criminal enterprise validated Victoria's strategic emphasis on coordinated international responses to sophisticated financial fraud. Individual jurisdictions had been addressing isolated components of a criminal network that could only be understood and combated through comprehensive international cooperation and shared analytical capabilities. Victoria's coordination also revealed that the criminal network employed many of the same methods and professional relationships that had been involved in Daniel's fraud and the other cases Victoria had investigated during her consulting practice. The patterns of professional misconduct, victim manipulation, and asset concealment were consistent across different countries and client populations, suggesting that sophisticated financial fraud followed predictable patterns that could be identified and disrupted through appropriate analytical methods. The international investigation's success depended on Victoria's ability to translate her individual consulting methodologies into collaborative frameworks that could be applied by multiple agencies with different institutional cultures and operational constraints. The challenge required developing training materials, communication protocols, and analytical procedures that preserved the effectiveness of Victoria's methods, while accommodating the practical requirements of international law enforcement cooperation. Victoria's solution involved establishing regional coordination centers that would serve as focal points for analytical collaboration within geographic clusters of participating countries. Each center received comprehensive training in Victoria's methodologies while adapting the procedures to address specific regional characteristics of financial fraud networks and legal frameworks. The regional centers also provided platforms for developing local expertise in sophisticated fraud investigation, while maintaining coordination with the broader international effort. Victoria's role involved providing ongoing consultation and quality assurance for the regional centers, while ensuring that analytical insights and investigative discoveries were shared effectively across all participating jurisdictions. Victoria's coordination efforts produced breakthrough results within 6 months of the partnership's establishment. The integrated analytical approach enabled investigators to identify previously unknown connections between criminal network components operating in different countries, leading to coordinated enforcement actions that disrupted the network's operations and recovered substantial assets for distribution to fraud victims. The enforcement actions included criminal prosecutions of key network organizers, professional sanctions against attorneys and accountants who had facilitated the fraud, and asset forfeiture proceedings that recovered over $800 million in concealed funds. The results exceeded the expectations of all participating agencies and demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated international responses to sophisticated financial crime. Victoria's role in achieving these results established her credibility as a coordinator capable of managing complex multi-jurisdictional investigations while maintaining the analytical rigor that had characterized her individual consulting work. The partnership's success validated Victoria's strategic vision for leveraging institutional relationships and analytical expertise to address systemic challenges that exceeded the capabilities of individual practitioners or agencies. The international partnership also created opportunities for Victoria to expand her influence within global law enforcement and regulatory communities. The success of the coordinated investigation generated interest from additional countries that sought to participate in future collaborative efforts, expanding the potential scope and impact of Victoria's coordination capabilities. Victoria's partnership experience also informed her understanding of the institutional changes necessary to address sophisticated financial fraud effectively on a global scale. The investigation revealed policy gaps and regulatory inconsistencies that enabled criminal networks to exploit jurisdictional differences and information sharing limitations to avoid accountability for their actions. Victoria began working with international policy organizations to develop recommendations for harmonizing financial crime enforcement procedures and enhancing information sharing protocols between countries. Her policy advocacy emphasized the need for standardized analytical training and coordinated enforcement capabilities that could respond effectively to criminal networks that operated across multiple jurisdictions. The international partnership experience also influenced Victoria's academic work by providing access to case data and investigative insights that informed research on global patterns of financial fraud and the effectiveness of different enforcement approaches. The research produced publications that advanced theoretical understanding of international financial crime while providing practical guidance for law enforcement agencies seeking to enhance their investigative capabilities. Victoria's partnership success also created opportunities for expanding her training and consulting activities to address international demand for enhanced financial fraud investigation capabilities. Government agencies, regulatory bodies, and private sector organizations from countries that had not participated in the initial investigation sought access to Victoria's training programs and analytical methodologies. The international demand for Victoria's expertise required developing scalable training programs that could be delivered effectively across different cultural and linguistic contexts, while maintaining the quality and effectiveness that had characterized her domestic programs. Victoria's solution involved establishing partnerships with local training organizations that could adapt her methodologies to regional requirements, while ensuring consistency with core analytical principles. Victoria's approach to international expansion emphasized building local capacity rather than simply exporting her methodologies without adaptation to local conditions. The approach ensured that training programs addressed specific regional characteristics of financial fraud while developing indigenous expertise that could sustain effective fraud investigation capabilities over time. The partnerships also created opportunities for cultural exchange and learning that enhanced Victoria's understanding of how financial fraud patterns varied across different economic and regulatory environments. The insights informed her research and policy advocacy, while improving the effectiveness of her analytical methods through exposure to diverse case types and investigative challenges. Victoria's first major international partnership demonstrated that her strategic vision for coordinated responses to sophisticated financial fraud could produce significant results when applied through appropriate institutional frameworks and collaborative relationships. The partnership's success validated Victoria's transition from individual practitioner to institutional coordinator, while establishing her credibility for pursuing even more ambitious collaborative initiatives. The partnership experience also revealed the scalability of Victoria's analytical methodologies and training approaches when supported by appropriate technological infrastructure and institutional relationships. Victoria recognized that the success of the international investigation provided a foundation for expanding her coordination activities to address additional types of financial crime and to include additional countries and institutional partners. Victoria's role in the international partnership established precedents for academic-government collaboration that could influence future approaches to addressing complex global challenges requiring coordinated analytical and enforcement responses. The partnership demonstrated that individual expertise developed through personal experience could be leveraged to create institutional capabilities that benefited numerous other victims and potential victims of sophisticated financial crime. The first major partnership had proven that Victoria's strategic approach could produce transformative results when applied through collaborative frameworks that leveraged the strengths of multiple institutions and jurisdictions. Victoria Chen had successfully transitioned from individual consultant to international coordinator, whose capabilities could address challenges that exceeded the scope of traditional law enforcement and regulatory approaches. Victoria Chen's remarkable success coordinating the international financial fraud investigation created unprecedented demand for her expertise and methodologies, but it also generated challenges that threatened to overwhelm her capacity for maintaining the quality and effectiveness that had established her professional reputation. The pressure to expand her influence while preserving the analytical rigor and personal attention that characterized her approach required careful navigation of competing priorities and institutional expectations. The immediate challenge emerged from the volume of requests Victoria received following the successful conclusion of the international investigation. Government agencies from over 20 countries sought consulting arrangements for developing enhanced financial fraud investigation capabilities. Private sector organizations requested training programs for their compliance and security personnel. Academic institutions proposed research collaborations that would expand the theoretical foundations underlying Victoria's practical methodologies. Each opportunity represented potential for meaningful impact and professional advancement, but accepting all requests would have required Victoria to compromise the thorough analytical approach and individualized attention that had produced her previous successes. Victoria recognized that scaling her influence required systematic prioritization and institutional development rather than simply increasing her personal workload beyond sustainable levels. Victoria's response to the scaling challenge began with a comprehensive assessment of her existing institutional commitments and their relative impact on advancing her strategic objectives. The assessment revealed that certain activities were producing disproportionate influence relative to the time and resources they required, while other commitments were consuming significant resources without generating corresponding advances in fraud prevention capabilities or victim protection measures. The Columbia-NYU Financial Fraud Research Center had evolved into a leading academic resource for forensic analysis research, but Victoria's administrative responsibilities were limiting her capacity for conducting the hands-on investigation work that informed her most valuable insights. Similarly, her role directing the Federal Financial Fraud Intelligence Center was generating important policy recommendations, but the bureaucratic requirements were reducing her availability for training law enforcement personnel in practical analytical techniques. Victoria's analysis led to a strategic restructuring that would preserve her influence within key institutions, while creating capacity for addressing new opportunities that aligned with her core mission of advancing fraud prevention and victim protection capabilities. The restructuring required delicate negotiations with institutional partners who had become dependent on Victoria's direct involvement in their operations. Victoria's solution involved transitioning from direct operational leadership to strategic advisory roles that would maintain her influence over institutional direction, while delegating day-to-day management responsibilities to other qualified professionals. The transition required identifying and training individuals who could maintain the quality and effectiveness of programs Victoria had established while adapting them to evolving institutional needs and external demands. The search for qualified successors revealed a shortage of professionals who possessed the combination of analytical expertise, institutional knowledge, and leadership capabilities necessary for maintaining Victoria's programs at their established levels of effectiveness. The shortage demonstrated that Victoria's unique background and experience were not easily replicated through traditional professional development pathways. Victoria addressed this challenge by establishing comprehensive mentorship programs that would develop the next generation of forensic financial analysts, while ensuring continuity of the institutional capabilities she had created. The mentorship programs combined intensive analytical training with practical case experience and leadership development opportunities that prepared selected individuals for assuming greater responsibilities within Victoria's institutional network. The mentorship initiative attracted exceptional candidates from diverse professional backgrounds, including experienced law enforcement investigators seeking enhanced analytical capabilities, academic researchers interested in practical applications of their theoretical knowledge, and private sector professionals who had encountered sophisticated fraud in their client work. The diversity of backgrounds enriched the program while ensuring that mentorship graduates could address fraud challenges across multiple sectors and institutional contexts. Victoria's mentorship approach emphasized experiential learning through supervised involvement in active fraud investigations, rather than classroom-based instruction in theoretical concepts. Mentorship participants worked directly with Victoria on complex cases, while receiving guidance in analytical methodology, victim advocacy techniques, and institutional coordination strategies that addressed both technical and human aspects of fraud investigation. The hands-on mentorship model produced graduates who possessed practical expertise comparable to Victoria's own capabilities, while bringing fresh perspectives and innovative approaches that enhanced the overall effectiveness of fraud investigation efforts. The graduates also provided Victoria with trusted colleagues who could assume leadership responsibilities for specific programs while maintaining coordination with her broader strategic initiatives. Victoria's institutional restructuring also required addressing the challenge of maintaining quality control and analytical standards across an expanding network of programs and initiatives that operated in different jurisdictions and institutional contexts. The expansion had created variations in training approaches, analytical procedures, and performance standards that threatened to dilute the effectiveness of methodologies that had been carefully developed through years of practical application. Victoria's solution involved establishing comprehensive certification and quality assurance programs that would ensure consistency of analytical standards while allowing adaptation to local requirements and institutional cultures. The certification programs provided standardized training curricula and assessment procedures that verified competency in core analytical techniques, while encouraging innovation and adaptation to address specific regional or sectoral challenges. The quality assurance framework included regular performance assessments, peer review processes, and continuing education requirements that maintained professional development among practitioners who applied Victoria's methodologies. The framework also established feedback mechanisms that enabled Victoria to identify emerging challenges and opportunities, while ensuring that lessons learned in one context could be shared effectively across her institutional network. Victoria's approach to scaling also addressed the challenge of maintaining her personal involvement in victim advocacy and support services while expanding her institutional influence and policy impact. Victoria's direct experience with financial fraud had informed her understanding of victim psychology and recovery processes, but her expanding responsibilities were limiting her capacity for providing individualized support to fraud victims who sought her assistance. Victoria resolved this challenge by establishing the Victoria Chen Foundation for Financial Fraud Victims, a nonprofit organization that would provide comprehensive support services for individuals who had experienced sophisticated financial deception. The foundation combined direct victim assistance with policy advocacy and educational initiatives that addressed both immediate victim needs and systemic factors that enabled financial fraud to flourish. The foundation's victim support services included financial counseling, legal referrals, psychological support, and practical assistance with asset recovery and legal proceedings. The services were designed to address the full spectrum of challenges that fraud victims faced while empowering them to become advocates for improved fraud prevention and victim protection measures. Victoria's foundation also established support groups that connected fraud victims with others who had experienced similar deception while providing platforms for sharing recovery strategies and advocacy techniques. The support groups served both therapeutic and educational functions, helping victims process their experiences while developing capabilities for contributing to broader fraud prevention efforts. The foundation's policy advocacy component focused on addressing regulatory gaps and legal frameworks that enabled sophisticated financial fraud while limiting victim recovery options. Victoria's policy work emphasized the need for enhanced victim protection measures, improved law enforcement coordination, and stronger professional accountability standards for individuals who facilitated financial deception. Victoria's scaling efforts also required addressing the challenge of maintaining work-life balance while fulfilling expanded professional responsibilities and institutional commitments. The intensity of fraud investigation work and victim advocacy had taken emotional and psychological tolls that required careful management to ensure Victoria's continued effectiveness and personal well-being. Victoria's approach to personal sustainability involved establishing clear boundaries between different aspects of her professional work while developing support systems that provided ongoing perspective and emotional resources. Victoria continued her therapeutic work with Dr. Lisa Park, while also developing relationships with other professionals who understood the unique challenges facing individuals who had transformed personal trauma into professional expertise. Victoria also established regular retreats and reflection periods that provided opportunities for processing the emotional demands of her work, while maintaining perspective on her broader strategic objectives and personal values. The reflection periods helped Victoria maintain clarity about her priorities, while preventing the overwhelming nature of expanded responsibilities from compromising her effectiveness or personal well-being. The scaling challenges Victoria faced also included managing the financial and administrative aspects of her expanded institutional network, while maintaining focus on the analytical and advocacy work that represented her core competencies and primary interests. Victoria's success had generated significant revenue streams through consulting fees, training programs, and speaking engagements. But managing these resources required administrative capabilities that Victoria had not previously needed to develop. Victoria addressed this challenge by establishing professional management structures that handled the business and administrative aspects of her expanded activities, while preserving her autonomy for making strategic decisions about program priorities and institutional partnerships. The management structures included experienced business professionals who understood nonprofit operations, academic administration, and government contracting requirements. Victoria's approach to financial management emphasized reinvestment in program development and expansion, rather than personal enrichment, reflecting her commitment to advancing fraud prevention capabilities and victim protection measures, rather than simply building personal wealth. The reinvestment strategy ensured that Victoria's success generated resources for addressing broader challenges while maintaining her credibility as an advocate whose primary motivation was public service rather than financial gain. Victoria's navigation of the scaling challenges demonstrated that sustainable expansion of individual expertise required systematic institutional development rather than simply increasing personal workload or accepting all available opportunities. The restructuring Victoria implemented preserved the quality and effectiveness of her work while creating capacity for addressing broader challenges and serving larger numbers of fraud victims and potential victims. The scaling process also revealed that Victoria's most significant contributions resulted from her unique combination of analytical expertise, institutional relationships, and personal experience with financial fraud, rather than her capacity for direct service delivery or administrative management. Victoria's recognition of her comparative advantages enabled her to focus on activities that generated maximum impact while delegating other responsibilities to qualified colleagues and institutional partners. Victoria's successful navigation of the scaling challenge established foundations for continued expansion of her influence while maintaining the analytical rigor and victim advocacy focus that had characterized her professional transformation. The institutional structures Victoria developed provided platforms for addressing even more ambitious challenges, while ensuring that her core mission of combating financial fraud and supporting victims remained the primary focus of her expanding professional network. Victoria Chen's rapid ascension from fraud victim to internationally recognized expert inevitably attracted scrutiny from established professionals who questioned whether her unconventional background and accelerated career trajectory reflected genuine expertise or simply effective self-promotion. The challenges to Victoria's credibility emerged most prominently during her nomination for appointment to the Federal Financial Crimes Advisory Board, a prestigious position that would influence national policy on financial fraud prevention and prosecution. The nomination process required extensive vetting by the Senate Banking Committee, whose members represented diverse political perspectives and professional backgrounds that emphasized traditional qualifications and institutional affiliations over innovative approaches or unconventional career paths. Several committee members expressed reservations about appointing someone whose primary credentials derived from personal experience with fraud rather than decades of academic study or government service. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee's ranking minority member, articulated the primary concerns about Victoria's qualifications during the preliminary hearing. Dr. Chen has certainly achieved remarkable success in a relatively short period, but we must consider whether her approach represents systematic methodology that can inform national policy or simply effective techniques for addressing individual cases, Senator Williams observed. The Federal Advisory Board requires members who can provide guidance based on comprehensive understanding of regulatory frameworks and enforcement procedures, rather than insights derived primarily from personal experience. The questioning reflected broader skepticism within established professional circles about Victoria's rapid emergence as a recognized authority in forensic financial analysis. Traditional practitioners had typically developed their expertise through decades of gradual advancement within government agencies, accounting firms, or academic institutions that provided systematic exposure to diverse case types and institutional perspectives. Victoria's unconventional pathway to expertise, while producing demonstrably effective results, challenged assumptions about professional development that were deeply embedded within the forensic analysis community. Her success threatened the perceived value of traditional career progression, while suggesting that practical experience and analytical innovation might be more important than institutional credentials for developing effective fraud detection capabilities. The credibility challenges intensified when Dr. Robert Pemberton, a prominent forensic accounting professor at Georgetown University, published a detailed critique of Victoria's methodologies in the Journal of Forensic Accounting Research. Pemberton's analysis questioned whether Victoria's behavioral analysis techniques met academic standards for empirical validation and whether her case results could be replicated by other practitioners working with different client populations. Pemberton's critique focused particularly on Victoria's emphasis on victim psychology and perpetrator behavior patterns, arguing that these subjective factors introduced bias and uncertainty into analytical processes that should rely primarily on objective financial data and established accounting principles. His analysis suggested that Victoria's methods might produce misleading conclusions when applied by practitioners who lacked her specific background and intuitive understanding of fraud dynamics. The academic critique gained support from several established forensic accounting firms whose principals argued that Victoria's approach oversimplified complex analytical processes while potentially exposing practitioners to professional liability if her methods produced incorrect conclusions or failed to identify fraud that traditional techniques would have detected. Victoria recognized that addressing these credibility challenges required more than defensive responses or appeals to her track record of successful case outcomes. The criticism reflected legitimate concerns about professional standards and methodological rigor that needed to be addressed through systematic validation of her techniques and demonstration of their effectiveness when applied by other qualified practitioners. Victoria's response began with a comprehensive research initiative designed to provide empirical validation for the behavioral analysis components of her methodology. Working with Dr. Sarah Kim and researchers from the Columbia-NYU Financial Fraud Research Center, Victoria designed controlled studies that would test the effectiveness of behavioral pattern recognition for detecting sophisticated financial fraud compared to traditional analytical approaches. The research studies utilized anonymized case data from Victoria's consulting practice and the international investigation she had coordinated, providing sufficient volume and diversity of fraud types to support statistically meaningful analysis. The studies compared detection rates, investigation efficiency, and accuracy of conclusions between practitioners using Victoria's integrated methodology and those employing traditional forensic accounting techniques. The research design also addressed potential bias concerns by ensuring that study participants were blind to the specific methodologies they were applying, and that case assignments were randomized to prevent selection effects that might favor particular analytical approaches. Victoria's collaboration with academic researchers provided independent oversight that ensured methodological rigor while addressing concerns about self-serving research design. The validation studies produced results that demonstrated statistically significant improvements in fraud detection accuracy and investigation efficiency when practitioners incorporated Victoria's behavioral analysis techniques into their standard analytical procedures. The studies also revealed that the effectiveness of behavioral analysis techniques was not dependent on practitioners having personal experience with fraud, suggesting that the methods could be taught effectively to qualified professionals with appropriate training. Victoria's research validation provided empirical support for her methodologies, while addressing academic concerns about subjective bias and replication challenges. The studies also identified specific training requirements and quality control procedures that would ensure effective implementation of behavioral analysis techniques by practitioners with diverse professional backgrounds. Victoria's credibility test reached its climax during her appearance before the Senate Banking Committee for confirmation hearings on her nomination to the Federal Financial Crimes Advisory Board. The hearing provided a public forum for addressing criticism of her qualifications, while demonstrating her expertise under intense scrutiny from senators who represented different political perspectives and professional constituencies. Senator Williams opened the questioning by referencing Dr. Pemberton's critique and asking Victoria to explain how her methodologies addressed concerns about empirical validation and professional standards. Victoria's response emphasized the research validation studies while acknowledging the legitimate need for systematic verification of innovative analytical techniques. Senator Williams, I appreciate the importance of ensuring that advisory board members possess methodologies that meet rigorous professional standards, Victoria responded. The research validation studies we have conducted demonstrate that behavioral analysis techniques, when properly implemented, enhance rather than replace traditional forensic accounting methods. The integration of multiple analytical approaches provides more comprehensive understanding of complex fraud schemes than any single methodology can achieve independently. Senator Williams continued her questioning by asking Victoria to explain how practitioners without personal fraud experience could effectively apply behavioral analysis techniques without introducing subjective bias or misinterpreting behavioral indicators. Victoria's response demonstrated her understanding of training requirements and quality control procedures that would ensure effective implementation. The key to effective behavioral analysis lies in systematic pattern recognition rather than intuitive interpretation, Victoria explained. Our training programs emphasize objective indicators and standardized assessment procedures that minimize subjective judgment, while enabling practitioners to identify behavioral patterns that correlate with fraudulent activity. The techniques are teachable skills rather than innate abilities that require personal experience with deception. The most challenging moment in Victoria's confirmation hearing came when Senator James Harrison, a committee member with extensive background in corporate law, questioned whether Victoria's rapid career advancement reflected genuine expertise or simply effective marketing of limited experience. Senator Harrison's questioning focused on the compressed timeline of Victoria's professional development, and whether her institutional appointments reflected careful vetting or expedient responses to public pressure for innovative approaches to financial crime. Dr. Chen, your professional trajectory from fraud victim to national expert occurred over a remarkably brief period, Senator Harrison observed. While your case outcomes are impressive, we must consider whether appointing someone with such limited tenure in forensic analysis to a position influencing national policy represents appropriate judgment or premature recognition of unproven capabilities. Victoria's response to this challenge required balancing acknowledgement of her unconventional career path with demonstration of the substantive expertise and institutional relationships she had developed. Her answer emphasized the systematic nature of her professional development while recognizing the legitimate concerns about rapid advancement. Senator Harrison, I understand the importance of ensuring that advisory board appointments reflect proven expertise rather than temporary recognition, Victoria replied. While my entry into forensic analysis was accelerated by personal circumstances, my subsequent professional development has been systematic and validated through peer review, academic collaboration, and successful outcomes in complex cases. The institutions that have appointed me to leadership positions have conducted thorough evaluations of my capabilities and contributions, rather than simply responding to public attention. Victoria's confirmation hearing also provided opportunities for her supporters to testify about the effectiveness of her methodologies and the impact of her institutional contributions. Catherine Morrison, from the International Association of Financial Crimes Investigators, described the success of the coordinated international investigation that Victoria had led, emphasizing the unprecedented level of asset recovery and prosecutorial success that resulted from her analytical coordination. Dr. Jennifer Martinez testified about Victoria's academic contributions and the research validation studies that demonstrated the empirical effectiveness of her methodologies. Professor Martinez emphasized that Victoria's techniques represented genuine innovation rather than repackaging of existing approaches, while noting that her methods had been subjected to rigorous peer review and empirical testing. Margaret Torres provided testimony about Victoria's effectiveness as an expert witness and the impact of her victim advocacy work on improving legal protections for fraud victims. Torres emphasized that Victoria's combination of analytical expertise and personal understanding of victim experiences provided unique capabilities that enhanced both investigation effectiveness and victim recovery outcomes. The confirmation hearing concluded with Victoria's presentation of her vision for advancing national financial fraud prevention capabilities through enhanced coordination between law enforcement agencies, regulatory bodies, and private sector organizations. Her presentation emphasized systematic approaches to addressing institutional gaps and coordination challenges that limited the effectiveness of existing fraud prevention efforts. Victoria's confirmation by the Senate Banking Committee represented validation of her credibility and expertise by the highest levels of government oversight. The confirmation process had subjected her qualifications to intense scrutiny while providing opportunities for addressing legitimate concerns about professional standards and methodological rigor. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.